Welcome to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This is where we blur the lines between business, nonprofit, and impact. Social entrepreneurs in our community share their stories of how they are changing the world and building a legacy of health, wealth, happiness, and wellness. I'm your host, Wendy V, along with my co-host, Rodrigo Bravo. Together, we're social entrepreneurs building a collective of impactful humans who are going to make this world a better place. We hope you'll join us. Here's today's episode. This is a really important episode for anyone who has a nonprofit or is thinking about starting a nonprofit. I go over 6 essential funding streams from a blog post I released, and I tell you how to coordinate and use the funding so that you can get your projects done. If you are someone who loves to serve nonprofits, think about how you can give in one of these 6 ways. I love this episode because it tells you exactly what you need to do to build a sustainable funding future for your initiative. Now, this is where we're going to talk about 6 must-have funding streams for your nonprofit. Now, my background is in management of government grants, and I did a lot of work in that space for a number of years. And if you don't know me, I'm Wendy. I'm a coach for socially conscious entrepreneurs. So if you're just listening to this for the first time and you have no idea who I am, that is who I am. And one of the things that I learned is that my background in nonprofits actually helped me a lot as I was working in the government, because I was able to better understand how funding was working when you were doing the programs and the pieces that were on the on the ground support for the different types of social services that are provided. So as you go through the things that you are doing, it's really helpful to, as a funder, understand how money is used on the other side. And not only how it's used, but also how people run into a couple of common hiccups that happen. So in this blog post, one of the things I wanted to do was, one, answer the question that I get from a lot of clients, which is, what are the different ways that I can diversify my funding for my nonprofit? So that is where I'm giving you at least 6 or way more, but this is these 6, I would say, fundamental or foundational funding streams that you can look for to diversify your funding portfolio. And most people have these in place if you have a nonprofit that's not a startup level nonprofit. But the other thing I'm talking about in this article is not only how you would get these different 6 funding streams, but also how you can use them together. And a lot of people go wrong in this sense, because people say, oh, well, I'm just going to blend all of this money together. And they might be tracking it and they might be using it in different ways. But there's actually 3 different funding models that I talk about in this blog post, where people can go and figure out how they're going to use their funding. So there's 3 different funding streams that I explain in this blog post. And those 3 funding streams are braided funding, blended funding, and then the other one is coordinated funding. So as I explain these 6 different funding streams, there's also 3 different ways that you can use them together. So in this blog post, that's what we're discussing, are these 6 must-have funding streams for nonprofits, and then also the 3 different ways that they can be used together to support what you're trying to do. So we're always trying to maximize our impact, making sure that we are reaching the highest number of people we possibly can. And if we can get to a coordinated set of funding to build sustainable programs as a nonprofit. So if you guys are just joining, I'm Wendy. I'm a coach for socially conscious entrepreneurs. And I was just, for the replays, giving a background that I've worked with nonprofits in the federal government as a government project officer, but then I also did a lot of nonprofit work prior to coming to the government. And these are some of the things that I learned as a funder that people might either misinterpret, not really think about when they're looking for funding. And often they'll go straight to asking for a grant, or they'll want a grant, but they won't have explored how that grant fits into the landscape of what they're already trying to do with their nonprofit. So that's where these different funding models come into play, because with your nonprofit, if you're adding grant funding to that in a coordinated way, you can actually do some really cool stuff. So this is where I'm going to keep going with these blog posts and explain some of the other things that you could do with these other funding models, but this blog post just introduces them. So if you want to click the link and follow along with me, I'm just going to get started talking about them. And if you want to ping people in, I already pinged some folks in, so I'm just going to get started. And if anyone wants to come up and ask questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll bring you up. So the first one I want to talk about is really common. It's individual donors. So these are just the people who will give either a one-time or a reoccurring donation, and usually it's a cash donation, but it could be goods and services. Sometimes you might see people giving a space or giving training, giving hours of something to a nonprofit. If they're a for-profit business or an individual, for example, sometimes it's not always just cash. And so you do want to make sure that you're tracking the goods and services in addition to the cash. So for individual donors, it could be a good and service. It could be, cash donations. And it's not the same as volunteer time. Like these donors are giving you something that is tangible. Now, the other one that goes along with that is major and corporate donors. So major donors, they could be individuals, but they could also be corporations. That's why I put them with corporate donors. But the major donors are really people who give one big donation that is sizable at least a year. So whatever sizable is for your organization depends on the scale of where you're at, but you would have to determine what you would be considering a major donor or a corporate donor. And sometimes corporate donors and major donors are ones that give, if you're maybe more than 100,000 in one gift or something like that. So you would determine what that is for that threshold. And one of the reasons why it's good to differentiate them from individual donors is because you can give them different recognition levels as different levels of donors. So if the individual level is, a certain set of things that they get every year, maybe a thank you from the executive director, maybe there's a luncheon or a Zoom or something they can attend. All of those things, might just be one-off that the individual can get, but then they might have an extra level of things for these major donors and corporate donors. So that's where you can start layering your strategies together with your funding opportunities. So major donors and corporate donors, like I said, they're businesses or they're corporations or individuals that give a sizable amount of money, and that's not related to a campaign that you're running. That literally is just a donation that they're giving you. Special events are really common because people can put out a special event and raise money for one particular cause, or it could be a recurring special event that you have every year. It really depends on what your nonprofit is trying to do. The only thing is special events always take some sort of legwork to put them on. So you're going to have to invest time and energy into actually having special events as part of your portfolio. But they also could be somewhat simple because you could just have a restaurant, for example, if you're a smaller nonprofit and you have a city where a restaurant is willing to give you a portion of their proceeds, and you would be getting people to come to their restaurant on a particular night, for example. That's one way that smaller nonprofits can engage in special events without having to really have a quote unquote event that they're manning for themselves. The next one is grants, and I put this one here, but I'm not going to talk about it yet. I'm going to go back to grants, even though in the blog post, if you're following along, that's where we're technically at. I'm going to go back and talk about campaigns. So there's different types of campaigns that you can run. I only broke them down into two. An annual campaign, which usually is just an annual time of year that you're soliciting for donations. And that might be corresponding with a particular time of year that you need money for something every year. It might also be something that you are, for example, every year we know at the end of the year, Salvation Army is getting money for the holidays with their little red buckets. We know that happens every year kind of because they've socialized us to think that we will go to the grocery store and we will see them out there with red buckets during that time of year. That is an example of an annual campaign. And so when you're putting together your different funding streams, you can have both an annual campaign, but you could also have a special campaign. And a special campaign is a sort of a one-off in addition to the annual campaign. Like you could have multiple special campaigns throughout the year for different reasons. If you're a nonprofit that has different programs, for example, you could have different special campaigns related to the different programs. You could also have different special campaigns related to an immediate need. Something came up all of a sudden and there's a need for a new building. You could have a special campaign related to raising funds for your new building. So there's a lot of different purposes for a special campaign. It's just something that would be above and beyond your traditional annual campaign of when you're soliciting for funding. And when you are doing that, you're really telling people, hey, you're buying into this concept. And so there's another marketing component that goes along with the special campaign in addition to the annual campaign, because those are ones that you're really putting out on all of your social media, all of your email list, your donor list. Like, everybody knows that this is your annual time of year, and then everybody also will hear that this is a special campaign you're running for this particular purpose. And so you have two different opportunities to make sure that your regular reoccurring solicitations are going out, and that you're asking people, hey, bring the money to me, but you're using all of your channels in a coordinated way to do that. So then the next one that we'll talk about are grants. And so this is the last one. This is the sixth one. If you're following along, we went back up to it. So you can go up in the blog post, just a couple of paragraphs. And grants are something that I worked on for probably about close to 14, 15 years when I was working in local and federal government. And grants are really competitive. And so you find things like people looking for grant writers, they can't find them. There's people are looking for grants, they can't find them. It's a really, really tricky process to get a grant. And so most people are not necessarily prepared to do the work of the grant, but they know they want a grant and they know they want to grow. So there's a lot of legwork that needs to happen before you actually go and find a grant that matches your needs. And so if you're in the space of looking for a grant, there's a bunch of things on my website that are in the free resources. If you navigate yourself to the free resources from the top button, that help you look for the right grants, to help you plan to write grants, and to really get prepared to do this work. So a lot of that stuff I put on my website for free so that you have the opportunity to go and get this funding if it's available to you. Because as a nonprofit, that is one of the things that differentiates nonprofits from businesses. Although there are business grants, there are far more nonprofit grants. So for nonprofits, it's really, really important that no money is left on the table. So although nonprofits are everywhere and they're all applying for the same grants, if you have a nonprofit and you qualify to apply for a grant and you're capable of doing the work, it's better that you try to find supports and put in an application than be intimidated and not put in anything. Because if you don't put in anything, then your cause is not going to get funded. But there are ways that you can use grants to your advantage where you're only looking for the ones that really, really match your interest. And that way, when your funder says, hey, I fund this thing, and you say, whoa, I do that thing, you're ready to put in a really strong application that's going to score highly. So you want to be ready to do that ahead of time. And that's what a lot of people call grant readiness. And a lot of that stuff you can do if you are putting in the time and effort before you even find the grant you want to apply to. So this is where it gets really tricky, because you have to think about, well, what am I going to use this money for? So we're going to move from the actual funding streams into the how are they coordinated together part of the blog post. So if you want to just kind of scooch back up beyond the funding streams, if you're following along, there's two different ways to think about this. And I put it in the blog post as spaghetti. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to have a visual for folks to understand how this funding works together. And one of the reasons why you have to think about what you're going to use the funding for is because sometimes if you're going to use the funding and it's a grant funded opportunity, you have to do certain things with it. And one of the things you can't do is just blend it all together. So that's where it looks like spaghetti. So that's what I'm explaining in this blog post. So if you are taking multiple funding streams and you're just putting them all together in a pot, you have no idea where the money came from. You have only the idea that it was spent maybe, but you don't really know which funding stream actually was spent on what, then that is called blended funding. And sometimes people who have a grant get in trouble for doing that because the grantor does not want them to do that. They want them to be able to track the money from the start to the finish of what it was spent on. So then you have models like braided funding where you can track, okay, this money went for these line items or these particular expenses. This other money went for these other line items or these other expenses. And that's all still part of the same project or the same budget, whatever way I'm managing that budget. And so it's really a little bit more of a segregation of the money and not so much a pooling of the money. And so that's why when you're thinking about it, spaghetti, you kind of might think about it as a bunch of spaghetti that's just sort of lined up and braided, but not necessarily all blended in together into the same plate, for example. But then you also have yet another example of the way that you can do this funding. So if you have these 6 funding streams and you have a, say, for example, a grant that says, you can't spend money from their grant on overhead costs, which would be rent or any kind of supplies or things that are all part of your overhead costs. So if you can't spend money from that grant on those things, you have to find it from somewhere else. So one of the things you could do is say, okay, this grant can pay entirely for program A. This grant can pay entirely for program B. And then this other money, which was my individual donors, my corporate donors, and my special events, for example, that can pay for everything else. So you have 3 different separate funding streams doing 3 different separate functions, but overall they together equal the entire functioning of your organization. So it's not that they're kind of even the same dish. My example for this in the blog post is they're a bunch of separate dishes on the same tray coming to you to consume them. And when you consume them, they're consumed in harmony. So that is where it's called a coordinated funding stream. So the difference between these different examples is that there's different purposes why a nonprofit would want to choose one over another. So in the example, like I said before, if you have different grants and different programs, then it makes sense to say, okay, these grants can't cover these costs, but I have this entirely other pool of money that can cover these costs. And you can use that coordinated funding stream. But even within that, you might have an example where that first program actually has 2 different funding streams. One is a federal and one is a state funding stream. But you can't blend them together. You have to braid them because the federal funding stream says that you can't blend them. So you may even have a braided funding stream for one program and another program that's entirely funded by a separate one, and then a whole separate section of work that you're funding, that you're doing, that is related to all these other ways that you're raising funds. So I know that that's super complicated, which is why in the end of the blog post, I mentioned that this is all really important if you're going to stay solvent, right? Like these are the kinds of lessons that make an organization sustainable or not. And as you're going through and trying to build a nonprofit, it's important that you build things in a way that's sustainable. So whether that's one program and service or that's the entire nonprofit organization, either way, you have to find what balance works for you. And so as you grow, you might start with one funding stream and not even need to do any of these things. But then as you grow and you have more and more and more access to these different resources, you might find that you start braiding funding streams, and then you might find that you get a grant, and then you might find that you need to coordinate and do a little bit more. So all of this is built for you to do as you need to do as you grow as an organization. And that's the beautiful thing about doing things in a sustainable way, is that as you grow, you're able to build and build and build upon the foundations of what you already had. So I wanted to do this room as like a half-hour-ish room, which I'm glad that that's like, I was able to, I got it in 25 minutes. Cool. And so I'll check and see if you guys want to come up and ask any questions, because I've been talking this whole time, but nobody raised their hands. So we'll see. And I see LaTanya and Rodrigo is coming up. Hello.
Hey, Wendy.
Hey, how are you? Did you enjoy your lesson in
Doing,
funding?
I did. No, and you know what? It's really dope that you're doing this because it is intimidating. It really is. Now, I've never written a grant. I've never participated or asked for a grant or anything like that. But I've been involved in grant work and trying to obtain a grant, as far as being part of a committee and then submitting it. Back when I worked for a transit agency, and it is intimidating. It really is, and I can't imagine somebody on their own as an entrepreneur going out there and trying to do that themselves. I just find it Very, very intimidating. So I guess my question for you is, when you're talking about these must-have kind of nonprofit funding streams, and I looked it over very briefly, but what do you think is probably like the best angle that somebody should start when they're looking for that? Just from ground zero.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of people overlook some opportunities that are really low hanging fruit. And so, for example, like me and Rodrigo, if you guys don't know, we're both big into websites and having a web presence. And as you're, going to inevitably as a nonprofit build a website, having a really solid donor page where you're funneling people to is the same as a business, right? It's the same as having a sales page or a funnel page where you're signing people up for your email list or giving your freebie or doing your whatever. You're going to need to make it visible. You'll need to make sure that people are accessing the information that's going to turn them from a fan into an actual donor. And that some of that is messaging and copy, some of that is style and placement and things like that, but all of those things are really super easy if you're already having a website built. So optimizing your website for individual donors is a very, very easy way to do that. And then you could just be adding on the different kind of segments of, okay, well, if you're an individual donor, here's now a button for corporate donors. So now you have the corporate donor part of it. And so I think it's not that you have to start anywhere in particular, but you have to think about what's the easiest for you given the resources that you have. Because some people, it's easy for them to just start with an event. For example, like the pizza event that I gave and I said earlier, you go to a local restaurant and say, hey, if I pack your place with people on a Friday night for pizza, will you give me XYZ amount of the proceeds? And for some folks, that's probably the easiest way to start. So it just depends, but I think you have to, one, be creative, and two, think about, you're going to get told no, but you're also going to get told yes. And so even if you are having an intimidation, you nonprofits a lot of the time, even if they're not really, if they're kind of told no, not right now or whatever, a lot of the times you're actually going to have a lot of yeses, whether that's through people individual donating or in, coming to your events or getting on your email list or whatever. So it's actually a good mindset for you to think you're going to win more often than you're going to lose. And if you think about it that way, any of the strategies become fair game, because you're really looking for the one that's going to help you win the most sustainable, but also the essentially, if you're starting out, the quickest way to get that funding. So none of that makes sense, Rodrigo, with all of the layers of complexity.
No, no, it actually makes a lot of sense. And you know what's really funny about that is that sometimes you're right. You overlook things that are maybe probably a little bit more simple. And right now, that example of the pizza that you had thought about, that you spoke earlier about, I didn't really grasp it, right? And you said it again, and it reminds me of the time that I was doing fundraisers for car washes for like my son's baseball team. And I remember how successful those things were, and just working with kind of a natural, like not having to reinvent the wheel, right? There's a natural kind of a market for people who want their vehicles washed, there in that particular neighborhood. And it was interesting that you're right. Sometimes we overthink things as opposed to going what we already know are our strengths. So for me, for example, I already know that, I can figure that out. It's not actually not that intimidating as long as I have like a precise little plan. And that's probably what I would need to do if I was embarking on this journey, to make sure I have a nice little plan, know what I need, and not overthink it. So I appreciate you giving us that example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even with the website, I have another person I'm working with that has a website, but it's just not optimized for people to be able to push the button to donate. And one of the reasons, because there's too many options to donate. You can go to one button and you'll end up on a GoFundMe. You can go to another button and you'll end up paying through PayPal. You can go through another button and you end up on a different platform. And so to the person coming to that sort of setup, it's confusing for them where you really want them to go. So if you're it just like in any marketing, when you're trying to get donors to do something, you have to give them a reason. And the cool thing about nonprofits versus a business is either way, the reason is in the story, right? But nonprofits often have people that they're either courting to teach them about the issue, people that are already passionate about the issue, or people who are so passionate they're instantly going to say yes. So you always have an opportunity to turn someone into a donor. And unlike a business, a lot of the times the people already, it's not that they once they become aware, they're instantly excited about it. So then it's your job to make it easy for them to donate the money to you. So if your website is not optimized, that it becomes a barrier or a challenge for them, that may mean they don't end up turning into a donor from someone who's just interested in this particular issue. So I think that's another reason why, the low-hanging fruit is really important, because you can always look for ways to get slightly better when you're improving what you're doing over time. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Social Impact Level Up podcast. For me, Wendy V, and my co-host Rodrigo Bravo, we sincerely appreciate your follows, your likes, your subscribes, and your shares. Make sure that you're reaching out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Have a wonderful day, and remember, keep changing the world.